Sarah Mitchell, Damian Clark, and Leo Burns were three lives bound by a deadly secret. In a high-security prison, Sarah was just a guard, until she crossed a line with two of the most dangerous inmates. What started as a forbidden connection would spiral into a twisted escape plan, one that would end in bloodshed, betrayal, and murder. With every choice they made, they inched closer to a fate none of them could outrun. In the quiet town of Ravenhill, the high-security prison stood as a fortress, home to some of the country's most dangerous criminals. Its thick stone walls and razor-sharp fences kept out the outside world, but they also kept the dark secrets of what went on inside. Sarah Mitchell, a young woman in her early 30s, had always dreamed of a stable career, and the prison guard position seemed like the perfect fit. Little did she know, this job would lead her into a web of deception that would change her life forever. Sarah had always been a dutiful and professional guard. She kept her distance from the inmates, maintaining the strict boundaries required in her job. But over time, things began to shift. Two inmates, Damian Clark and Leo Burns, began to stand out. Damian, with his piercing blue eyes and dangerous charisma, was impossible to ignore. He had been convicted of armed robbery and murder, but there was something in his presence that made Sarah uneasy, and at the same time, strangely intrigued. Leo, on the other hand, was quieter, a man of few words, but there was an unsettling calm about him. He had been sentenced to life for a series of violent assaults, and like Damian, he had an air of mystery that piqued Sarah's curiosity. The first signs of their connection were subtle. Damian would catch Sarah's eye when she passed by his cell, a brief glance that lingered just long enough to make her feel uncomfortable. At first, she brushed it off as part of the job. The inmates were often trying to get attention in one way or another. But something about the way Damian looked at her felt different. There was a hidden message behind his gaze, one that she couldn't quite decipher, but that she found herself thinking about more and more. It didn't take long for Sarah to begin interacting with the two men in small, seemingly innocent ways. She would occasionally deliver messages or ask questions when she made her rounds. She justified these actions to herself, telling herself that it was part of her duty to maintain a rapport with the inmates. But as the weeks passed, the lines between duty and personal involvement began to blur. Damian's charm worked its magic, and Sarah found herself looking forward to his quiet, calculated conversations. She couldn't deny that there was something magnetic about him, something dangerous and irresistible that she couldn't turn away from. Leo, too, began to influence Sarah. He wasn't as forward as Damian, but his calm demeanor made Sarah feel at ease in a way that no one else could. He seemed to understand her unspoken fears and insecurities, offering quiet encouragement when things at work became difficult. While Damian played the role of the charming troublemaker, Leo was the silent observer, offering just enough comfort to make Sarah feel special. She felt understood in ways that her colleagues, even her friends, never did. Before long, Sarah's professionalism began to falter. She found herself looking for excuses to spend more time near Damian and Leo, whether it was during routine checks or passing by their cells on her rounds. She started to notice small things about them, the way they spoke, the way they moved, the subtle hints they dropped about their pasts. They were skilled manipulators, and it was only a matter of time before they began to weave a dangerous narrative around Sarah, playing on her growing loneliness and vulnerability. As Sarah's feelings for the two inmates deepened, so did their plans. It started with small favors, smuggling in a cell phone, turning a blind eye when one of them passed something through the bars. The stakes grew higher each time, and Sarah's involvement in their world deepened. She knew she was crossing a line, but each time she looked into Damian's eyes or heard Leo's quiet voice, the guilt became easier to ignore. She was no longer just a guard. She had become a key player in a secret, dangerous game, a game that no one outside the prison could ever have imagined. As the weeks passed, Sarah's involvement with Damien and Leo deepened, and the lines between right and wrong blurred further. At first, she justified her actions as part of her job, just small favors for two inmates who had formed an unusual bond with her. She told herself it was harmless. After all, what harm was there in slipping them a few extra privileges? A cell phone here, a discreet conversation there. But deep down, she knew she was stepping further into dangerous territory, and each act of betrayal made it harder to turn back. It was Damien who first spoke of escape. In the beginning, it was nothing more than a casual remark, thrown out in the middle of one of their conversations about life on the outside. "Wouldn't it be nice to just leave all this behind?" he had said, his voice a mixture of longing and cynicism. Sarah didn't take it seriously at first. Inmates often talked about escaping as a way to cope with the confines of prison life, a fantasy to distract from their reality. But Damien's eyes gleamed with something more than idle daydreaming. There was a purpose behind his words, a plan forming in the darkness of his mind. Leo, ever the silent observer, had remained quiet about the idea. But Sarah began to notice the small signs, the way he would glance at Damien with a knowing look, the way his fingers drummed against his cell bars when the topic of escape came up. He wasn't opposed to the idea. In fact, he seemed to encourage it in his own quiet way. It wasn't too long before Sarah understood that the two men were not just fantasizing, they were plotting something real. It started with small requests. Damien would ask Sarah to pass along a few things, tools that could be used to manipulate the locks on their cells, or objects that could be fashioned into makeshift weapons. At first, Sarah hesitated. She had a professional code to follow, and giving in to such requests seemed like the kind of breach that could destroy her career, her entire life. But Damien was persuasive, and over time his charm wore down her resolve. He spoke of freedom, of a life beyond the prison walls. Sarah, who had grown increasingly frustrated with her own life, found herself fantasizing about the very same thing. But it wasn't just the promise of freedom that drew her in. There was something intoxicating about the danger. For the first time in years, Sarah felt alive. The thrill of secrecy, the weight of every hidden gesture, the tension that hummed in the air whenever she found herself slipping contraband past the guards. It was like an escape of its own. Every step she took into the world of the inmates made her feel powerful, important. For once, she wasn't just a lonely, overlooked guard. She was the key to their freedom. The plan took shape quickly. It started with Damien and Leo digging through their cells, secretly chipping away at the concrete walls during the dead of night, when the guards were distracted. Sarah was the one who ensured their progress went unnoticed. She'd cover up the small holes they made in the walls with clever misdirection, ensuring no one suspected anything was amiss. It was a slow process, but as the days wore on, Sarah could see that they were getting closer to their goal. She would sometimes catch the men discussing the next steps in hushed tones, their eyes glinting with anticipation. The thrill of their conspiracy was contagious, and Sarah found herself swept up in the excitement. Meanwhile, the prison authorities were growing more and more suspicious. Strange things had begun happening, small inconsistencies in the records, guards reporting odd behavior from certain inmates. But Sarah, always the professional when on duty, kept up the facade. No one suspected that the quiet, efficient guard was involved in the biggest escape plot the prison had ever seen. Yet with every passing day, Sarah's internal conflict grew. She knew the risk of being caught, and she understood the consequences. If the escape failed, she would not only lose her job, but she could face criminal charges herself. But in her heart, she was already committed. She had invested too much in this dangerous game to back out now. As the escape plan began to take shape, Sarah found herself walking a thin line, torn between the woman she had always been and the person she was becoming. The night of the escape arrived with a quiet intensity that felt almost unreal. For weeks, Damien and Leo had been working tirelessly on their plan, and Sarah had played her part, ensuring that every detail was meticulously arranged. She had smuggled in tools, forged documents, and manipulated the prison security systems in ways that no one could have imagined. Everything was in place. This was it, the moment when everything they had worked for would either succeed or fail. As the clock ticked past midnight, Sarah's nerves began to fray. She walked the prison halls, her footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. The usual hum of security cameras and the occasional sound of the guards' radios seemed strangely distant tonight. She kept her head down, focused on the task at hand. This wasn't just another night shift, this was the night that could change everything. If she succeeded, she would be helping two of the most dangerous men in the prison escape. If she failed, she didn't dare think of the consequences. The plan had started small. A few adjustments to the prison's security systems, a blind spot in the camera coverage that only Sarah knew about. She had used her position to gather information, studying the routines of the guards and the security checks until she knew when to act and when to disappear into the shadows. She'd played her role perfectly, providing Damien and Leo with everything they needed, from tools to insider knowledge. All that was left now was the final step. Damien and Leo had been preparing for weeks, chiseling away at their cell walls when the guards were distracted. They had studied the prison's layout, learning every weak point in the system. Tonight they would finally break free. The guards, tired and complacent, would never know what hit them. Sarah made her way to the control room. She had one final task before the escape could unfold, disabling the security cameras. She took a deep breath, her fingers trembling slightly as she punched in the code. The screens flickered, and for a brief moment Sarah thought she saw her reflection staring back at her, tired, unsure. But she pushed the thought aside. There was no turning back now. She glanced at the clock. It was time. Sarah made her way to the cells, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't shake the sense that something might go wrong. But when she arrived at Damien and Leo's cells, everything was quiet. Too quiet. The two men were already out, standing in the shadows, waiting for her signal. With a nod, Sarah led them down a hidden hallway, one that she knew well from her time patrolling the lower levels. The path was narrow and poorly lit, but they had a few minutes to make their way through undetected. Damien was the first to speak, his voice a low whisper. "We're almost there." Sarah said nothing, but the tightness in her chest grew. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the thick walls, but in her mind she heard every echo, every sound that might alert someone to their presence. They passed through locked doors that Sarah had tampered with earlier in the week, and every time her pulse quickened, a bead of sweat running down her back. But the path was clear. They were so close. Then, as they neared the last door, leading to the tunnels beneath the prison, the unexpected happened. One of the guards, Mike Thompson, appeared from around the corner. He was just a few paces away, and Sarah froze, panic washing over her. Her mind raced as she calculated the odds. Mike was a good man, a colleague, someone who trusted her. He'd seen her working late, seen her at her posts. But he wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't part of the plan. For a moment there was no sound except for the beating of Sarah's heart. Mike paused, looking at her with a faint smile, his tired eyes scanning the group before landing on Damien and Leo. For the briefest second, Sarah saw something in his gaze, a flicker of suspicion. Everything happened in an instant. Without thinking, Sarah acted. She reached for her radio and turned it off, cutting off the communication that could alert the rest of the guards. Then, in a split-second decision, she did something she would never have imagined. She pulled out the small weapon she had hidden in her uniform, a tool she had never intended to use, and struck Mike with a sudden, brutal force. His body crumpled to the floor, lifeless. The weight of what she had just done hit Sarah like a cold wave, but there was no time to process it. Damien and Leo moved quickly, pulling her into the tunnel entrance. There was no turning back now. The escape was in motion, and with one life lost, there was no way to undo what they had started. The echo of Mike's body hitting the floor seemed to linger in the air, but Sarah pushed the thought aside. She couldn't afford to think about it now. They had to keep moving further into the darkness, away from the life they had all left behind. The escape had begun, and with it came the relentless pressure of the chase. As Damien, Leo, and Sarah moved deeper into the underground tunnels beneath the prison, the sound of their footsteps was the only thing that accompanied them. It felt surreal. This was the moment Sarah had been working toward for months. The adrenaline from the escape and the violent act that had sealed their fate surged through her veins, making everything feel heightened, almost dreamlike. But as they moved further away from the prison, the reality of what had just happened started to sink in. Mike Thompson's body lay back in the hallway, and Sarah could still hear the hollow thud of the blow that had ended his life. She pushed the thought away, unable to afford the luxury of guilt or remorse. The escape wasn't just a fleeting fantasy anymore. It was a life-or-death situation. If they didn't make it out, everything she had done would be for nothing, and the consequences would be far worse than anything she had imagined. They had to keep running. The three of them crawled through the narrow tunnels beneath the prison, the stench of damp earth filling their noses. There was no turning back now. Sarah's heart was racing, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she led them through the labyrinthine passageways. She had memorized the tunnel system during her time working at the prison, knowing it like the back of her hand. But even with her knowledge of the layout, she couldn't shake the sense that time was running out. The longer they stayed underground, the closer they came to being discovered. Damien seemed unfazed, moving with a purpose and a calmness that was almost unnerving. Leo, on the other hand, was quieter than usual, his eyes darting around as though he was listening for every sound, every whisper of movement. The tension between the three of them was palpable. They had pulled off the escape, but the hardest part was still ahead, the world beyond the prison walls. As they neared the exit of the tunnel, Sarah felt the weight of their situation. It wasn't just about getting out of the prison anymore. It was about staying out. The entire town was on edge. The authorities were already on high alert, and the manhunt had begun. News of the escape would have spread like wildfire. Every law enforcement officer within 100 miles would be combing the area, looking for any sign of them. They couldn't afford to be caught. When they finally reached the tunnel's end, Sarah was the first to crawl out into the night air. The cool breeze hit her face, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the tunnels. She could taste the freedom in the air, and for a moment, she let herself feel the weight of the accomplishment. But that fleeting moment of triumph was quickly overshadowed by the reality of what they were facing. Damien and Leo followed her out into the woods, their faces shadowed in the dim moonlight. The forest was dense, the trees thick and dark, offering them some cover as they moved quickly through the underbrush. But the momentary sense of freedom quickly began to dissolve. They were running not from just the prison, but from everything they knew. They were fugitives now. No longer just prisoners, but wanted criminals, their names and faces plastered across every news outlet in the country. The next few days were a blur of hiding, running, and barely escaping detection. They moved between abandoned houses, sometimes sleeping in the woods, other times finding shelter in old barns or trailers. Each day they heard more reports on the radio, the news anchors talking about the 3 dangerous criminals on the run. Sarah, for the first time, felt the weight of their choices. Every step forward felt like a step deeper into a world of violence and betrayal. Damien, ever the instigator, seemed eager to keep pushing, to stay on the move, always looking over his shoulder. Leo, on the other hand, had begun to voice concerns. He wanted to lay low, keep to the shadows, avoid unnecessary risks. He knew how dangerous it was to be constantly on the run. But Sarah found herself aligning with Damien, the thrill of their escape keeping her bound to the chaos they were creating. She felt like they were invincible, unstoppable. The feeling of being wanted, of being hunted, had become strangely intoxicating. But the cracks in their unity were starting to show. The tension between Leo and Damien grew every day, and Sarah found herself caught in the middle. She had helped orchestrate this escape, but now she wasn't sure how much longer it could last. They were becoming more than fugitives, they were becoming liabilities to one another. Each passing day brought them closer to either freedom or a violent end. The tension among the three fugitives reached a breaking point when they found themselves holed up in a dilapidated cabin, deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. The days of running, hiding, and constantly evading capture had taken their toll. They were no longer a well-coordinated team. The cracks in their fragile alliance were widening, and the once strong bond between Sarah, Damien, and Leo was now fragile and frayed. Sarah, exhausted from days of constant fear and uncertainty, couldn't help but notice the growing rift between Damien and Leo. Damien, driven by his need for power and his unquenchable thirst for freedom, constantly pushed for action. He wanted to keep running, keep moving, keep ahead of the law. But Leo, always more thoughtful, was growing increasingly wary. He had become the voice of caution, urging them to lay low, to blend in with the shadows and stay out of sight. The two men's differing views on survival began to clash in ways that made Sarah uneasy. Each night as they sat around a fire, the tension would build. Damien would talk about the thrill of the chase, the freedom they had stolen from the system, and the promises of what awaited them on the outside. But Leo's silence spoke volumes. He was no longer convinced that the escape was worth the cost. His thoughts, always carefully guarded, began to reveal themselves in fragments. Paranoia, doubt, fear. He was starting to realize that survival might require more than just speed and audacity. It would take sacrifice, and perhaps even betrayal. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cabin, the simmering conflict finally exploded. Damien, ever the instigator, snapped at Leo. The argument had started over something small. Leo's suggestion that they hide out in a nearby town until the heat died down, but quickly spiraled into a full-blown confrontation. Damien accused Leo of being weak, of holding them back, of not having the guts to follow through on the escape they had worked so hard for. Leo in turn lashed out, his words sharp and cutting, accusing Damien of being reckless, of pushing them toward disaster. Sarah, caught between the two men, felt the weight of the situation press down on her. Her heart pounded as the argument escalated. The anger and distrust in the air were suffocating. She knew that one wrong move could tear them apart for good. The betrayal she had once feared was no longer a distant possibility. It was unfolding in front of her eyes. She was no longer just the accomplice. She was now a part of something far more dangerous. Damien's rage finally reached its peak. He turned on Leo, his anger fueling a violence that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. Without warning, he pulled out the small, concealed weapon he had hidden on him. Sarah froze, the world around her seeming to slow down as Damien's eyes locked onto Leo's. In an instant, Leo was on the ground, a look of shock and disbelief frozen on his face. Sarah's heart raced, but she couldn't move. The reality of what had just happened didn't fully hit her until Damien turned toward her, his expression cold and unfeeling. "Now we can truly be free," Damien said, his voice low and steady. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Sarah's mind struggled to process what had just occurred. Leo, the quiet and thoughtful man she had once trusted, was dead, shot in cold blood by the person who had once been her partner in crime. The man who had whispered promises of a new life outside the prison walls was now a murderer, and Sarah, who had stood by and watched it happen, was complicit. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. In the chaos that followed, Sarah knew that there was no going back. Leo's death wasn't just the end of his life. It was the final nail in the coffin of any hope for a clean escape. They had crossed a line so far beyond redemption that even if they made it to freedom, they would never be the same. As Damien pulled her toward the door, ready to continue their flight from the law, Sarah realized the escape was no longer just about freedom. It was about survival, about trying to outrun the weight of their actions, the consequences of their choices. And as the night closed in around them, she knew that her life would never be the same again.